So far in Kubernetes, we have discussed how to deploy our applications, right? How to communicate with our application, how can we access our applications within the cluster or outside the cluster, and how to use volumes if you are deploying some stateful applications, like how to maintain the state of our applications, what is volume, what is PVC. Now we will discuss about the security. How can we secure our cluster? Right? So role-based access control. How can we give an access, or how can we restrict access to the API server? So in Kubernetes, we can give an access to the API server based on the role. So first, let's try to understand when request is sent to the API server. When we send a request to the API server, whenever we are executing, kubectl command, whenever we are executing kubectl command, any request to the API server via CLI or via GUI, right? When request is sent to API server, it will first authenticate. It needs to be authenticated. It needs to be authenticated, which means to make sure that whether the requester is known to the system. Then it will authorize. There are two things, authentication and authorization. Suppose you are having a Kubernetes cluster. You are having a Kubernetes cluster. You have a master. In the master, you will have API server, scheduler, all those things, right? In the control plane, whether it's a self-managed or cloud managed, you have a control plane. In self-managed, we will manage control plane. In managed services, the provider will manage the control plane. So when request is when request is go to the API server, when we are executing CLI, kubectl commands, right? From this can be CLI or UI. When request goes to the API server, first it will authenticate. There will be two things. It will authenticate, then it will authorize. Then only it will allow you to perform some operations. First authentication will happen, then authorization will happen. Then only it will allow. If you have a permissions to create a deployment, it will allow. If you don't have a permissions to create a deployment, it will not allow. So if you observe, right, whatever kubeconfig file we have, right, under config file we have a cluster details, API server details. Request will go to the API server. and it will try to authenticate whether you are getting request from a admin user or whether you are getting request from any normal user, like, right? It will try to authenticate if this user has a permission. Suppose I have a kubeconfig admin file. It will try to authorize whether this guy is allowed to perform this operation or not. So if you see, when a request is sent to the API server, first it will authenticate before it will authorize, right? RBAC is a way to define which users can do what within a Kubernetes cluster. RBAC, role-based access control, is a way to define which users can do what within a Kubernetes cluster. If you are working on a Kubernetes for some time, right, you may have a scenario like where you want one guy like Michael from development team to have only access to some resources which are in development namespace. Like you are trying, you have some kind of a requirement, like there will be a development team, there will be a DevOps team. You don't want to give complete permissions to the development team, like they cannot deploy the applications, they cannot update the applications, they cannot delete the deployments, right? Maybe they want, you want to limit their scope within some namespace. You don't want them to give a complete access. So to achieve these type of things, role-based access, we will use a concept of RBAC, authentication and authorization in a Kubernetes. RBAC is a way to define which users can do what within a Kubernetes cluster. Broadly, there are three types of users who will access Kubernetes cluster. Broadly, there are three types of users who will access Kubernetes cluster. There are three types of users who will access Kubernetes cluster. First, developers and administrators. Developers and administrators. Second one is end users. Third one is applications or boards. We call it as an applications or boards. So there are three types of users who will access Kubernetes cluster: developers or administrators, end users, and applications. One application can access Kubernetes cluster for some reason. So what is the role of developers and administrator? Why developers and administrator need access to the Kubernetes cluster? What is their role in Kubernetes cluster? The developers and administrator who will access the Kubernetes cluster, what is their role? For deploying, right? Users who are responsible for do administrative or developmental tasks. This includes operations like upgrading the cluster or creating the resources like pods, deployments. To deploy the applications in a Kubernetes cluster, developers and admins will access the Kubernetes cluster. How they will access? With the help of kubectl, CLI, or GUI. But rarely we will use GUI. Dashboard. We can set up a dashboard, Kubernetes dashboard, GUI. The way you have a UI for AWS, right? Similarly, you can have a dashboard for Kubernetes. So users that are responsible for doing administrative task. And what is the role of end users? Why, what we, end users will access? Is end users is going to access the API server, I mean to say the control plane. The end users, are they going to access the Kubernetes cluster, or they are going to access the applications which is deployed in a Kubernetes cluster? Only applications, right? End users that who access the applications deployed in your Kubernetes clusters. So these guys are accessing the applications, not the control plane, right? Access restrictions for the users are managed by application itself, like application level security. The development team will take care. So end users will access only the applications. End users are not going to access your control plane. Now, third type of users. We have another type of user. Applications or boards. There is a possibility that other application need access to Kubernetes cluster or API. There is a possibility that some application need access to the Kubernetes cluster or API. Typically, to talk to resources or workloads inside the Kubernetes cluster. There is a possibility that some application needs to talk to Kubernetes cluster or API. Typically, it will talk to some resources within the Kubernetes cluster. The Kubernetes facilitates this using service account. Applications, like what kind of applications? We already deployed some applications that requires access to the Kubernetes cluster or API. How we have provided access to those applications for an API or API server? What concept we used? I already gave an overview, right? We provided an access to those applications using service account. What type of applications we deployed which need access to the API? We deployed lot of applications. That application also requires access to the Kubernetes cluster, Kubernetes API. What type of applications we deployed? Metric server. While doing a while deploying a metric server, also we have created a service account role binding. Then metric server, then ingress. Yesterday we deployed ingress controller. While deploying a ingress controller, also we have created a service account role binding. Then next one, cluster autoscaler. Like some applications like this, right? We deployed the cluster autoscaler. Did I created a service account and I have given a permissions with the help of service account? Yes or no? So there are three types of users who will need an access to the Kubernetes cluster. End users doesn't need access to the API. End users are going to access the applications which are running in a Kubernetes cluster. Now, how can I provide access? How can I restrict access to the developers or administrators or applications, right? With the help of RBAC. RBAC is a way of defining what users can do within a Kubernetes cluster. Role-based access control. RBAC is based on three key concepts, guys. RBAC is based on the three key concepts. One is verbs, API resources, subjects. RBAC is based on three concepts: verbs, API resources, and subjects. Verb. Verb is nothing but set of permissions that can be executed on a resources. Verbs, resources, subjects. Verb is basically set of operations that can be executed on a resources. Operations like verb is nothing but operations, set of operations like create, read, update, delete, CRUD. Verbs is nothing but set of operations that can be executed on a resources. What is resource here? API resource. We call it as API resource. API resource or workload, Kubernetes workloads, right? What are resources here? Kubernetes resources, API resources. These are the objects available in the cluster. Like what are the API resources? Like we have pods, we have deployments, services, replication controller, replica set, daemon set, stateful set, PV, PVC, HPA, all are these are Kubernetes resources, Kubernetes workloads. So RBAC is based on three concepts. Verbs. Verbs is nothing but operations or operations that can be executed on a resources. Resources are nothing but the objects in the Kubernetes cluster. And subjects. What is subject? The subjects is basically users or group or service account allowed to access API based on verbs and resources. Verbs is nothing but a set of operations that can be executed on a resource. Resource is nothing but the Kubernetes object. Subject is nothing but the user or group or process, I mean to say service account, allowed to access the API. So we are going to define permissions using this concept: role, role binding, right? We are going to define a role, something like this. This is again one Kubernetes object. We are going to define a role, something like this. Role, kind is role, API version is this. This is the role name. These are the rules, permissions. If you see, by looking at this role, if someone is mapped with this role, someone is binded with this role. If someone is mapped with this role, maybe like a developer or DevOps engineer, or maybe the service account, right? What permissions they are going to have? Will they going to have all the permissions, or they are going to have only limited permissions? As per this, the role, what permissions, if someone is mapped with this role, what permissions they will get? If you see, this is self-explanatory. Permissions. Verbs, what type of actions he can perform. Resource, what resource we are giving a permission. By looking at this, if someone is mapped with this role, some developer or some service account is mapped with this role, will they able to perform everything, or they can only see the pods, they can only create the pods? Will they able to create a deployment? If someone is mapped with this role, will they able to create a value? Will they able to create daemon set or deployment? Except delete, they can do other, but on what? On what resource? Am I giving permissions to all the resources? Only pods, right? So we can give a permissions based on these concepts: verbs, resources, and subjects. Now we can define a role. And where are we mapping, or where are we linking the role with the subject? Subject in the sense user or service account or group. I am creating a role here. Where are we mapping that role with subject, like a user or a group? Where are we mapping? If you see, there is a concept of role binding. Role and role binding. Here we are defining a role. Here we are mapping this role, whatever role we are creating, right? That can be mapped with subjects here in the role binding. So suppose this is one role. This is one role. Here I am giving permissions only. Pods, you can only see the pods, watch the pods, and list the pods. I am not giving create also. So we are creating a role here. In the rules above, we have a API groups. We have a resources. Which resources are allowed for access and actions. And to map these permissions to the users or service account, we are using role binding. So here we are binding this role, whatever role we created, we are binding that role with subject here. We are linking the role with subject. Subject can be user or service account or group. So we are defining a role. We are mapping role with user. So based on that, right, the user will have a permissions. The user will have a permissions. And there are two things. Very important question. What is difference between role and cluster role? We have another object called cluster role. We have another object called cluster role. I can create a cluster role. Something like this. Instead of role, this is cluster role. The way I have a role, I can create a cluster role also. The way I have a role, right? If you see role, similarly, I can create a cluster role. Same API groups, resources, verbs. But what is the difference between role and cluster role? Right? Anyone has any idea? Excuse me. What is the difference between role and cluster role? It is not like that. Role and cluster role. The main difference is role is used within a namespace. At a namespace level, I want to give a permission. Role is used inside a namespace, inside of a namespace. If I want to give a permissions, within one namespace. Like I don't want to give access to all the namespaces. Role is used inside of namespace, while cluster role is without namespace boundaries. So I want to give a specific permissions to only some namespace. I can use role. I want to give permissions to some objects across all the namespaces. Suppose I want to give pod access only some namespace, within only some namespace. I can use role. If I want to give permissions to pods across all the namespaces, I have to use cluster role. The difference is that role is used within a namespace, while cluster role is cluster-wide permission across the namespaces. If you see, while creating a role, we are mentioning the namespace. Under which namespace? Under which namespace you are trying to create a role. Suppose someone is mapped with this role, they can perform these operations only within that namespace. Suppose same thing if I am doing with the help of cluster role, and if I map this cluster role with cluster role binding, then whoever is mapped with this role, they can perform these operations in all the namespaces. We have a role, cluster role. Similarly, you have a role binding and cluster role binding. You have a role binding, cluster role binding. So cluster role is across all the namespaces, role is within the namespace. Now, Kubernetes uses RBAC to control different access level to the resources depending on the rules we have set in the role or cluster role. Right? So if you see, as of now, I am able to perform all the operations. As of now, I am able to perform all the operations within that Kubernetes cluster with the help of kubectl. Let me log into the Kubernetes client machine. As of now, I'm able to perform all the operations. If you say I'm able to get the nodes, I'm able to get the namespaces, I'm able to create a namespace. If you see, I'm able to create a namespace, I'm able to delete a namespace. I'm able to do all the operations. How it is happening? If you see, we have a kubeconfig file. If you see, we have a kubeconfig file. So we are using EKS cluster. So authentication will happen using IAM. There are two things, guys. there are two things. When we are accessing cubes, any Kubernetes request goes, right? Authentication and authorization. So there are multiple different types of authentications. Since I am using EKS cluster, it is using IAM for authentication. IAM concept. We can use certificate based authentication. Kubernetes supports lot of authentications. Kubernetes supports lot of authentications, right? Kubernetes supports certificate based authentication. Certificates based authentication, token based authentication. It will support lot of authentication mechanisms. If you observe, right, if you have created a self-managed Kubernetes cluster, we are going to have a user with certificates in our kubeconfig file. If you observe the kubeconfig file in a self-managed Kubernetes cluster, under this user section, you will have some username and some certificates. Root admin user. The default you will get an admin user. But in case of EKS Kubernetes cluster, it is going to perform IAM based authentication. It is going to perform IAM, AWS IAM concept it will use. It is going to perform IAM based authentication. Now, if you remember, while configuring this Kubernetes machine, while configuring this client machine, I have configured AWS CLI. As a which user I have configured AWS CLI, what access key and secret key I have used in this? What access key and secret key I have used? Root, admin access key, root of AWS. So obviously will the root account will have access to all the resources in AWS, right? And also it is allowed to perform all the operations in EKS also. If you see already there will be some roles, kubectl get cluster role. If you see already there are lot of roles here. There is a role already, admin role. This guy, if you see this role, admin role, it will have all the permissions. Kubectl describe cluster role admin -o YAML. I need to use, instead of describe, I need to use get cluster role in a YML format. Now, if you see, there is already one role, cluster role, which is created by default. Already one cluster role. If you see cluster role, if you see the rules, do you see all the permissions like create, delete, patch, update on API groups, right? Config maps, secrets, create, delete, daemon sets, deployments, replica set, stateful set, auto scaling, horizontal pod autoscaler. They can create, delete, update, all the permissions. This admin role is mapped with the system user. If you see cluster role binding, if you see cluster role binding, that admin role is mapped with some here. Maybe here it is mapped with this. The admin role is mapped with subject in this role binding. If you describe, if you get in a YML format, cluster role binding. If you see, it's mapped with group system masters group. So that admin, whatever admin we are using, right? That is basically kind of a system which has all the permissions. So that is why I am able to perform all the operations. I can do whatever I want to do. Authentication is happening with the help of IAM in this EKS cluster. Suppose if you use self-managed Kubernetes cluster, you will have a certificate-based authentication. Certificate-based authentication. Now, in a self-managed, you can generate a certificate by following these instructions, whatever I have given. In a self-managed or in a Kubernetes cluster which is created using kops, Kubernetes cluster which is created using kops, also you can follow these instructions to get the certificates and generate the certificate for a user. You can generate the certificate for a user like developer, and if the developer is using that certificate in the kubeconfig file by following this instruction, authentication will happen. Authorization is based on the role and role binding. Based on the role and role binding, he can perform the operations. Based on the role and role binding, what permissions you are giving for the developer, user or group, he can perform the operations. Now in EKS, it's IAM based authentication. Now, as of now, I am using root permissions. Do we get root user? Like all the developers have a root access to the AWS so that they can, if you are using EKS, all the developers will have a root access. Does all the developers will have a root access? No, right? So I will show you now. Let's assume I am a developer. I have a IAM user. So I will use my credentials to connect to the AWS EKS, and I will access with the help of my credentials. Let's see what will happen. Now this is having a root user, root credentials. He can perform everything. Now let's assume I am a developer. In my laptop, in my terminal, in my laptop, my terminal. This is my laptop terminal. As a developer or as a DevOps guy, yesterday I configured, I think, with root credentials. I think I will be able to access, right? So now let me delete. I will delete. As a developer, as a DevOps engineer, you may not get root credentials of AWS. So now let me remove. Let me delete everything, the kubeconfig file also. Let me delete AWS credentials also. Now I just have a kubectl installed. I have a kubectl installed. I have a AWS CLI installed. And I have a AWS IAM authenticator. AWS IAM authenticator. I have AWS IAM authenticator installed. So we have a AWS IAM authenticator installed. I already have, okay, this is the command. So AWS IAM authenticator also there. Now I have to access as a developer, as a DevOps engineer, I am trying to access. Now since I have a kubectl, if I execute, now why I am getting this error? What is the problem? I am trying to use kubectl commands. What is the problem now? What is missing first? What is required first? No, what file is missing? What file is missing? This kubectl will expect what? The kubectl will expect the kubeconfig file. Now, how can I generate the kubeconfig file? In case of EKS, what command I can use? In case of EKS, what command I can use to generate a kubeconfig file? In case of EKS, how can I generate the kubeconfig file? How can I get the kubeconfig file? I don't have a master, right? And again, you will not have an AWS, like master machine is not there. You cannot go and grab that kubeconfig file from the master. It is managed by AWS, the control plane. How did we generated the kubeconfig file in this server last time when I set up the client? I can use. How did I generate it, guys? Using AWS CLI. AWS EKS. For now, let me execute list clusters. Later, I will execute that one. Now, what is the problem now? Do I have a permissions to execute? I mean to say, did I configure my AWS CLI? Now, the AWS concept, I will not have a root account. I will not get a root access. So the AWS the AWS admin will have a root access. So now I will not get a root access. What I will maximum get, I will have a normal IAM user permission. So for now, I don't have a root access, AWS root access, right? So as a normal IAM user, I will get a normal access key and secret key. As a Kubernetes admin, let me create a user. Let me say Mithun, AWS IAM user. I want to give a programmatic access. If you want to give console access, you can give. This we already discussed in AWS. Let's assume this is a normal AWS user. So now I'll not attach to any group in AWS, right? This is AWS concept. I just created a user. Like this is normal user. So I will have a normal user. So this is my access key and secret key. Now I will configure with my credentials, right? This is my access key. This is my secret key. I configured my AWS CLI with my credentials. Now, if I execute EKS list clusters, now what is the problem? This is nothing to do with Kubernetes, guys. Now, what is the problem? I am not able to list the clusters, and definitely I cannot update my kubeconfig also. Now here I am trying to discuss about AWS authorization also. Now what is the problem? Why I cannot execute this command? Why I am not able to perform this operations? It's nothing to do with Kubernetes, right? It is nothing to do with Kubernetes. I am executing AWS commands. I am trying to get the kubeconfig file. So user doesn't have a proper what permissions? Kubernetes permissions or AWS permissions? The AWS permissions, right? So this guy is not able to get the cluster details. He is not able to get the kubeconfig file. Now, let me give AWS permissions to this guy. Right? If you want to create a role, right? You can create, if you want to create a group, you can attach that group. For now, let me directly give permissions. I will directly use policies. Now, if you don't have a policy, right, you can create a policy. Now I want to give this guy a EKS read-only policy, guys. EKS cluster read-only policy. I want to give EKS cluster read-only policy. So if you don't have that policy, EKS read-only policy, you can create a policy on your own. So if you see what I have done, I am trying to create a policy for this user directly, or you can create a policy and attach here. Go to user or go to policies, create a policy. Now I am trying to give only access to this service, EKS. What permissions you want to give, right? If I select this, what will happen, guys? What type of permissions? Do you want to give a create, delete cluster, create cluster, delete node group, create node group? I don't want to give all the permissions to that user. If I select this, all the permissions, I don't want to give all. Suppose he is a developer. Do you give all these permissions, AWS permissions? If I select all, if developer is attached with this policy, what he can do, guys? Will he delete, can he delete the Kubernetes EKS cluster? Are you allowing? So this is AWS, right? So he can delete. So I don't want to give all the permissions. I am trying to give only list. He can list the cluster. And read, he can describe the cluster. Because when I execute this command, when I am trying to execute this command, what it is saying? He is not able to perform this operation and list this permission. So I selected only list and read permission. Again, to which cluster you want to give? Again, all the clusters, or all the clusters, or only specific cluster? In this account, if you have a lot of clusters, in this cluster, if you have a lot in this account, if you have a lot of clusters, if you want to give access to all the clusters, you can select all, or if you want to give specific, you can add the EKS ARN, AWS ARN. If you want to give all, you can select all. As per the best practice, if you want to limit, you can only give specific policy, specific cluster, something like this. Add an ARN. So under, you can get the ARN of your EKS. So let me show that. Let me open another tab. As a Kubernetes admin, I am creating a policy. This is AWS policy. So this is my ARN, cluster ARN. So I am trying to create a policy. That policy will have only read-only permissions, again for not all the clusters. If I select, if I provide that here, now only for this cluster, right? Then if you want to customize still, you can customize. For now, that is fine. Now review the policy. I am going to give EKS demo cluster read only policy. This is AWS, guys, nothing to do with Kubernetes as of now. Now, if I attach this with that Mithun user, AWS user, Now let me go here, attach permissions, attaching existing policies. I just created EKS. This one, just we created this policy, right? Now let me attach. Now will be able to execute now that list clusters? Will be able to execute now that list clusters? He can list the clusters. Now will he able to execute this command also to get the kubeconfig file for this cluster? Now if you see, I got a kubeconfig file. I got a kubeconfig file. I got a kubeconfig file. So here you don't see that username. But whatever user you have configured, with that user, it will try to authenticate. Now here you don't see that username Mithun, but it will try to execute some command, this command, and it will pass the token. Now if I execute kubectl get nodes, I have IAM authenticator. I have already installed IAM authenticator. I am trying to execute kubectl get nodes, right? I think I have already authenticated. Okay, so now I will show the issue. I will show the what needs to be done. Now I am not able to do anything because this IAM user is not configured in Kubernetes. This IAM user is not configured in Kubernetes. You are not authorized. As of now, you are not authorized, right? So now in a Kubernetes, now I have to provide this user information. I have to provide this user information in a Kubernetes. Now, as admin of Kubernetes, here I have access. I have access to everything. Now, here I need to do some small setting for that IAM user. kubectl get config map AWS EKS kubectl get config map. Let me use in all the namespaces. One second. Now that IAM user has to be defined in the AWS so that it can authenticate. So if you see, there will be a config map by default. There will be a config map by default in kube system namespace, but somehow it is not showing. Sorry, kube config I have, kube system I have to use. kubectl get config map -n kube system. So there will be a config map. This Kubernetes EKS will use this config map for authentication. Kubernetes EKS cluster will use this config map for authentication. If you see, as of now, This has only this information. If you see, it is mapped with system root. Now here, I need to update this one. I need to map with that user. In this config map, I need to map with the user, whatever user I have created. So create one IAM policy, which we have already done. As admin, create IAM user with policy to list and read EKS cluster to get the kube config file. This we have already done. Again, as a Kubernetes admin, as an admin of EKS cluster, you need to update this config map. You need to update this config map as a Kubernetes admin. Here I have an admin access. I need to update this config map. Here I need to provide that information. Whatever IAM user I have created, right? That I will update here. I will map the users. Something like this. Map users. So you have to map the users. And you need to give a user ARN and user name. User ARN and username. User ARN and username. Username is Mithun, and you need to give that user ARN. Username is Mithun, the user ARN. So if you go to AWS, right, this is the user ARN. You have a user, right? This user ARN. So now Kubernetes API server will use this information for an authentication purpose. Kubernetes API server will use this information for an authentication purpose. Now, if I see, I will get authorization issue now, like I will not able to perform, right? You don't have access to do this. Now, if you see, I'm getting different error. Now authentication is happening, but as a Mithun user, did I belongs to any role, cluster role in a Kubernetes cluster? If you see, I cannot get the nodes, I cannot get the pods, I cannot get deployments. Now, if I want to give this user to the permission, I want to give this developer, I want to give access to the some namespace, development namespace. I want this user to create, read the pods, get the pods, and I want this user to create a pods. What needs to be done as a Kubernetes administrator? What you have to create now in this cluster as admin? What you need to create now? So far, authentication is happening. Authentication is outside of Kubernetes. Now, authorization. I want this Mithun user to have access to this namespace. What needs to be done, guys? What needs to be created? In the Kubernetes, what object needs to be created? How can I give the permissions? RBAC. In RBAC, if I want to give a cluster permissions, I mean to say across all the namespaces, what needs to be created? cluster rule. If I want to give permissions to specific namespace, then rule. So now, as a Kubernetes admin, here I can do, because I have access to everything. I can create a role, I can create a role binding. But he is a developer, this guy is a developer. He cannot do anything as of now. If you see, his user Mithun cannot list resource pods. He cannot get the deployments. So here, I can create a role or cluster role. I can create a role or role binding. So that guy will get a permission. Now let me show that. So here, role, something like this role, we are creating role binding. So we are creating a role, something like this. Let me explain here. Resources, API groups, resources, verbs. Guys, API groups, if you see something like this, whatever you see with version 1, in RBAC, you can define API group something like this, just empty, which represents whatever Kubernetes resources, API version is V1, all fall under this one. Okay. API group, this one, resource, what resource? Pods. Get update list. If I want to allow him to do this, create, delete. So now he can delete the pods. He can get the pods. He can update the pods. He can list the pods. And there is a one more called watch. So these permissions for a pods. So only he will get a permissions for pods. Suppose if I want to give a permissions for service, I can give something like this, service, comma separated service. If I want to give for a replication controller, I can give something like this. Suppose if I want to give permissions to the deployment or daemon set or replica set, what is the API group? Right? It is not V1, right? So I have to fill those details. For advanced, basically objects, the API group will be different. Suppose if I give something like this, what will happen? Instead of defining in this way, if I define something like this, API groups star resources star verbs star full access. Again, full access, I am using a role, not the cluster role. For all the objects, we are going to give a full access. But again, I am creating a role. So full access for which namespace I am giving here? For the development namespace. So if I define something like this, right? For advanced versions, the API group will be app. Here, if I want to give a deployments, something like this. Get, update, list, watch, create, right? If I want to give for all the like stateful set, I can give stateful set. You can define your permissions something like this here. For stateful set, suppose your requirement is for stateful set, you don't want to give a delete permissions. So what you can do, you can have something like this. You don't want to give a delete permissions for a stateful set, something like this. You can define something like this. So you are going to define a role as admin. You are going to define a role, right? If you want to see the the API groups, API resources. So if you see for daemon set, API group is apps. So suppose I want to give something like this. Apps. Guys, please be on mute. I hear some background noise. I don't know who is that. So now I am trying to create a role, not the cluster role. If you see apps, deployments, right? For deployments, I am giving all the permissions, right? Suppose for stateful sets, right? I am not giving. I am giving just get permissions, list permissions, create permissions, and watch permissions. So here, pods, service, replication controller, replica set. You are trying to give permissions, something like this, replication controllers. Guys, whatever you see API group empty, what does it mean? All these versions are starts with V1 API version. So in your RBAC, you can give something like this, empty. So for all the config maps, right? Nodes, persistent volume claims, pods, replication controllers. All these will start with V1. So in RBAC, you can give something like this. Now let me create a role something like this. As a Kubernetes admin, I am creating a role. As a Kubernetes admin, I am creating a role. As a Kubernetes admin, I am creating a role. The default namespace. So now let me create a role as a Kubernetes admin. Now role is created. But as of now, I have not mapped that role with this subject, this user. Still, I will not get a permissions. I just created a role as a Kubernetes admin. Next, what needs to be done? You need to bind that role. You need to bind that role, whatever role you have created. Role binding. That role binding. So if you see, this is my role name, dev role, right? Role name is this dev role. And here, if you see, something like this. I am creating a role binding, right? subject. Here we are linking subject with role. Here this is my username, right? Mithun user. This user is mapped with this role now. Now if I create this role binding, I already have a role. I am trying to bind that role with subject. Role binding. Now if I apply this, as admin I am doing, as a Kubernetes admin. Okay, sorry, the namespace name is wrong. The namespace name is default. I am trying to created a role for default namespace and I am binding. Now this guy, the developer, now will he able to get the pods? Now do you see he is able to get the pods? Is he able to get the pods? Now here. Now do you see he is able to get deployments? He is able to get stateful set. But let me do this. DS. Why is not able to get the daemon sets? Why is not able to get the daemon sets? Because we have not given the permission, right? If you see this role, we created a role, we mapped this user with this role. I have given permissions, pod permissions, update, list, create, delete, watch, deployments, update, create, delete, watch, stateful sets, only get, update, list, create. And I have not given a permissions for daemon sets. I have not given permissions for daemon sets, right? And also if you see, I have given permissions for a service. He can, so services, I need to services, like plural, right? Not service, services. Now I have given permissions for service. But if you see, I am not able to get daemon sets. I am not able to get persistent values, persistent volume claims. I cannot create, update, anything. So if you see, I have given stateful set access, but I cannot delete. If I see kubectl delete stateful set, if I try to delete a stateful set, I am going to get a access forbidden. User Mithun is not, he cannot delete this one because I have not given a permission. So similarly, I cannot perform cluster level operations. I cannot get the nodes and I cannot get the namespaces. I cannot get the namespace and I cannot see the pods in a different namespace. I cannot see pods in a kube system namespace. If you see, I cannot see objects in other namespaces. because I have used role, not the cluster role. If I want to give permissions at the cluster level, then what object, like what concept I have to use? Guys, in the interviews, they are not going this much extent. They are asking what is role, what is role binding, what is cluster role, what is cluster role binding, right? So if I want to give access at the cluster level, what needs to be created instead of role? We need to create a cluster role and we need to bind with subject, cluster role binding, something like this. Instead of role and role binding, you can use cluster role and cluster role binding, something like this. So now let me do this. Let me create cluster role. Let me change this. It will be exactly same, but you will not have a namespace. It is not bound with namespace. It will be cluster role. Something like this. It should be small. Now here, instead of role binding, it should be cluster role binding. Then you are binding this user with this. Here also it should be cluster role. Now I am creating a cluster role binding. So whatever permissions I am giving here, he can perform these operations in all the namespaces. So let me apply this. Now, if I come here, now do you see he is able to get the pods in all the namespaces? Because I created a cluster role now and I mapped with that user. He can get, but again he cannot delete whatever permissions I have not given. So RBAC is a way to secure our Kubernetes API. RBAC is a way to secure our Kubernetes API. Using RBAC, right, we can define which users can do what within a Kubernetes cluster, right? So this document is prepared here. If you see whatever I discussed, that is not, I have not discussed these things here. Whatever steps I have given here, this is for a normal Kubernetes cluster. Like if you have created a Kubernetes cluster using Kubernetes self-managed, right? Or if you have created a Kubernetes cluster using KOPS, the authentication will happen based on the secure, certificate. The authentication will happen based on the certificates. So here, what I have done, I have used the certificates of the Kubernetes cluster, and I generated a kubeconfig file. I generated a kubeconfig file for that user, for this user, with the help of those certificates. But since I am using EKS cluster, in a EKS authentication will happen in a different way using IAM. So I explained IAM based authentication, but RBAC is same, guys. There is no change in the RBAC concept. Authorization, role binding, cluster role binding, there is no change. But that authentication is little different in a EKS cluster compared to the self-managed Kubernetes cluster. So this is how you can secure your Kubernetes cluster using RBAC. So here what is RBAC? What is role? What is role binding? These are most important concepts. Cluster role versus role. Cluster role binding versus role binding. And what is service account? These are the questions you may get in an interview. What is service account? Or they may ask in a different way. How will you restrict access to the Kubernetes API? Kubernetes API, or how will you restrict access to the Kubernetes API or Kubernetes cluster? What concept we will use in one term? How will you restrict? With the help of RBAC, role-based access control. These are the important points to be remembered, right? This is all about RBAC. Okay, if you have any questions, feel free to ask. Else we'll continue tomorrow with the Helm, guys. These are full advanced concepts, right? We'll continue tomorrow. What is Helm? Why do we need Helm? If you have any questions, feel free to ask. I have 2-3 minutes I can spare. Okay, guys, if you don't have any questions, thank you. I'm stopping the session for today. Guys, we are discussing Kubernetes, all these topics, Docker and Kubernetes at an expert level, not beginner, not intermediate level, not advanced level. We are discussing at an expert level, right? As a fresher, as a 2-3 years of experience, you don't need this much depth in the Kubernetes subject, but definitely it will help you in a long run. So that's why we are spending a lot of time. You no need to worry, sir, what is this? You are discussing lot of things I am not at all able to understand, right? But it will help you in a long run. We are trying to discuss all these concepts in an expert level. Once you practice all these things, once you are familiar with all these concepts, right, you will have a better opportunities. Okay? But for a 2-3 years experience, you don't need this much knowledge in Kubernetes. Okay? Thank you, guys. We'll continue tomorrow with Helm. I'm stopping the session for today. We'll continue tomorrow. Yes, sir. Without this also, you can try for a CKA. Like our students, lot of students already cleared CKA. For them, I have not explained EKS, I have not explained taints, tolerations, but still they were able to clear the interviews for you, and they are able to clear the CKA in the first attempt itself. Okay, so definitely you can clear CKA if you practice. You have to practice first. You should not directly appear. You have to do a lot of hands-on. Then you can appear for CKA. Definitely you will be able to clear in a first attempt itself. So a lot of our students already cleared CKA. For them, I have not explained this much also. Like I have not explained taints, tolerations, and also affinity. And for them, I have not explained cluster autoscaler, but still they were able to clear in a first attempt itself. Thank you guys. We'll continue tomorrow on Helm.